Okay. Okay, thank you for joining us on One Stop TV and AlwaysLooking.com for our first broadcast. I'm honored to have my good friend Kenny Polcari. Kenny is the director of NYSE floor operations on behalf of O'Neill Securities. Kenny is also a very frequent guest on CNBC, Bloomberg, CNN, and too many different media outlets for me to name, actually, for this interview right now. Also, please check out KennyPolcari.com and follow Kenny on Twitter at Kenny Polcari and AB at AB Mendez. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Wanted to talk a little bit at first about your personal history on the floor of the NYSE. What attracted you in the first place to that particular job? And kind of, I think the nature of the market itself from a human and from a technology perspective has changed a lot over the last 30 years. You started working there around 80, right? So what was the mood, what was the feel on the floor of the exchange at that time, and as compared to now?
Yeah. Well, listen. Let's start with the history, right? So I'm a kid from Boston. I graduated Boston University in 1983, but I had my first experiences down on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in the summer of 1980, 81, and 82. I ended up having the opportunity to come down as a runner. At the time, 1980, the floor was 5,500 Type A personalities in an open outcry auction market. I had never been on the floor of the exchange. I had this opportunity to come down there. I went down there and I visited, and I'll never forget it. It was the most exciting place in the world. I mean, you have to envision 5,500 Type A personalities all in one room. I mean, the energy just from that alone is amazing, right? So the summer of 1980, 81, 82, I was down there just as a runner. I was getting to know people. I was getting to understand the language because it very much was a foreign language, right? When you were in an open outcry auction system, people would speak in shorthand in order to get it done, right? Stocks had symbols. We traded in fractions, so people spoke in fractions, right? An eighth, a quarter, 3/8, a half, stuff like that. And so it was really a process of learning, right? But I will never forget it. I was there for probably 3 weeks in the summer of 1980, and all of a sudden it just bit me. Because don't forget, I was 19 years old. What did I know what I wanted to do, right? I had no idea what I wanted to do. Yet I had this opportunity to move to New York and spend a summer and go work on the exchange. I thought, well, okay, let me try it. Not having any idea that it would change my life.
How'd you get that gig as a college student?
How did I get that gig? Isn't that an interesting opportunity? My dad was in the business as a retail broker up in Boston, and then during his career moved from being a retail broker to being a specialist on the floor of the Boston Stock Exchange. And so he used to regularly interact with people in New York. And then in 1977, 78, started a business, an options execution business. Options were just absolutely taking off in 77, 78, 79. And so he saw an opportunity and started this kind of options execution business here in New York. We still lived in Boston, but he had partners here in New York. And it was through that business that I had the opportunity to move to New York and work with independent floor brokers on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
I'm going to pull a Marco Rubio here because I put my paper way too far off camera. But when you see footage from back in the day, you see people scribbling notes and holding stuff.
Right.
Can you draw me what did those things look like?
If this was an order pad,
right.
The clerk in the booth would stand. You would stand in a booth space. The clerk would. That was as wide as your shoulders. So it might have been 15 inches was your whole workspace. And in your workspace there was the counter. There was your phone. There might have been 2 phones. They were old style steel case phones with the buttons, and the customers were connected. And the phone rang. You'd hit the button, pick it up, and you'd be talking to a customer. Right now, for the most part, 1980, the rules said that we could talk to other broker dealers. Right, you couldn't ultimately talk then. You couldn't talk to the customer, meaning the hedge fund, the mutual fund, the pension plan. That was illegal. Right? I was on the floor of the exchange. I could talk to other broker dealers. So I could talk to the guys at Goldman Sachs, First Boston, Morgan Stanley, all member firm broker dealers. I could talk to non-member firm broker dealers, small regional broker dealers around the country. But I couldn't talk to the customer. It was illegal for me to do that. But anyway, so there were tickets on. There were pads on the counter. Now the pads would be buy and sell pads. So on this pad, it would be This one would be a buy pad. So the word buy would be printed there. On the sell pad, it would be sell, right?
Okay.
Because but then the rest of it would be blank. And what you would do when the phone rang and you picked it up, and the customer might say to you, buy 100,000 Hewlett Packard, the clerk in the booth would actually write the order, right? So it would be buy 100,000, and then Hewlett, you'd have to put the symbol, and then you'd have to put either the price or a line if it went the market, right?
The bid, offer.
Right. And so on this ticket, it was very interesting, right? So there was a B for buy, so you know it was a buy order. Then there was the size of the order. It was 100,000, it was 5,000, it was 500, whatever it was. You'd have to write it down. Now, you would write it. 100,000 would be written as 100 and an M with a line through it, not a K, but an M with a line through it. 1,000 would be 1 and an M and a line through it.
Roman numeral, I guess.
No, it's just, well. Might have been Roman numerals, all I know is what it was, right?
Okay.
And then the symbol of the stock. Now, Hewlett Packard, you couldn't sit there and write out the word Hewlett Packard because you'd spend all day. So every stock had a symbol. In New York, every stock on the New York Stock Exchange used to be 1, 2, or 3 letters long. So you might have Ford was the letter F. American Telephone was the letter T. But Hewlett Packard then was HWP. HWP, that's what they selected. Does it mean that, is there any reason? No, that's what Hewlett Packard selected when they came listed, right? And then you would put the price. A line meant the customer was telling you to buy it at the market, a physical price, or they would say you got a $20 top. So I could pay $20 or less, but I couldn't pay more than $20 because I had a limit, right?
Right.
That's what this ticket would look like. If it was a seller, it would just be the same thing except be on a sell ticket, right? But these pieces of paper were really, this is what made it function, because then I would rip this off the pad, I'd timestamp it, and I'd put up my broker in the booth. There was a booth pad, there was a pad, right, a button pad, and I'd press a button, and the broker would have a beeper on his waist. And every time you hit the button, the beeper would go off, and he'd look down, and there would be a number there, and he'd raise his hand from the middle of the crowd, and he'd get a squad. And a squad used to be one of those kids that would run around.
A squad?
A squad.
Okay.
And what they were really a page.
Right.
And they would run back and forth between the broker in the crowd and the clerk in the booth, because I was not allowed to go on the floor. As a clerk in the booth, my job was to stand in the booth. Not only that, because I was talking to customers, but I was not allowed to go on the floor and trade, because in order to go on the floor, you had to be the member. You had to be the one that had your licenses and had the
person. What if he's sick one day? Can somebody else come?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Absolutely. There were other
Right.
independent brokers that would fill in, right? Or we might have, like where I was working, we had 2 brokers, right? So if one was out, I had another one, right?
Right.
But on top of that, I had other independent brokers that I could also fan out business to, and that would help me out, right?
Right.
But the squad would run back and forth between the clerk in the booth and the broker in the crowd. He'd bring out the order, he'd bring back completed orders, right? We had all the executions on there. When the executions came back, it would be my job to pick up the phone and call the customer, because don't forget, there was zero technology. There was no connectivity.
Except for the pager.
Nothing. That's it, except the pager, right? So I'd have to pick up the phone and call the customer, and I'd say to the customer, you bought 5,000 at $20, you bought 5,000 at 20 and a half, you bought 2,200 shares at 20 and an eighth, whatever it was, whatever the execution was, it was. And it was all written on this ticket with all the people I bought or sold the stock to, right? So there was a badge. That's why you see the brokers with badges, right? It's got a number. The number is the broker's identifier, right? Because you can't write down every time I traded with A.B. Mendez, I wrote down I traded with 123. If that was your badge number, I traded with, broker number 67 or broker 703. And in fact, my badge number when I first started was 1703. And so you would always write down the badge number. The number shows you bought, the price at which you bought it at, that's what was on this little piece of paper. But this piece of paper ended up being, at the end of the day, my receipts, right? My work. This is how at the end of the day I would create my bills from this and send a bill to the customers, because I earned my money on commission. So that's what it was. But that first year, 1980, I was the runner. I was the kid going back and forth between right? But I have to tell you, it was the most exciting place in the whole world, just because the energy. It used to start at about 9:15. The people would get there. They'd start to get ready for the day. They'd be organizing their work. Don't forget, because there was zero technology on the floor. So we didn't have computers, you didn't have a television, you didn't have a radio. All the information we got because someone on the outside used to call in and tell us what was going on. So it's very interesting. We were always the last to know, right? People thought, oh, this guy's got all the information. The truth is, I might have had information about what I was trying to buy and sell on behalf of customers, but I didn't have information about what was going on in the world, right? I used to get that information from the outside, from the customers.
Did you end up moving around from the clerk position to other,
No, I
roles?
stayed with that when I went. Well, during the summers when I was just acting as a squad, I would be all over the place, right? In the summer of 1982, I had come back because this independent broker had offered me a job. The summer when I left in '81, the following summer, 1982, he had offered me a job. Come back, you work for me next summer. Blah blah blah. So when I came back in May of 1982, let's just paint this picture for a minute. The economy was in a horrible place. Interest rates were 18%, going to 21%.
It's hard to imagine right now.
It's very hard to imagine, right? Unemployment was better than 10.5%. So we had just come through the Iranian hostage crisis, right? The country was in a very, very bad spot. Jimmy Carter was now no longer president. Ronald Reagan was now the president, right? And so there was a lot of turmoil in kind of the U.S. economy. Very much like today in the sense of despair, but yet different in the sense that inflation was running away. So interest rates were 18 to 20%. Well, think about this for a minute. If you're an investor and you can go to the bank and take your money and buy a CD and get 20% guaranteed with no risk, and you can sleep at night, what are you going to do? You're going to take your money and put it in the bank and get 20% guaranteed.
I take it.
Or are you going to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, you're going to take this money and you're going to buy stocks.
Wait, depends. Are you down there?
No, I wasn't down there. But are you going to go and buy stocks that that a lot of people still didn't understand? Because don't forget, it was not nearly as open as it is today.
There wasn't so much retail
There
investing.
no, retail investors were investing through mutual funds, right? But were you going to even take your money and put it in a mutual fund that carried risk? Or were you going to go put your money in a bank and get 20% or 18% guaranteed, and you're going to go to sleep every single night?
Right.
With no risk.
And there were no index funds at that time.
No, there was none of that, right? And so what happened was, in the summer of 1982, when that was at its worst meaning when interest rates were at their highest, what was happening on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange was death. Kind of mimicking what's happening today, right? Because there was no volume, right? People were not putting money in mutual funds. Mutual funds, by the way, were not nearly as popular then as they were in the in the 80s, 90s, and 2000, and as they are today. And so therefore, volume, if we traded 35 million shares a day, that would have been a lot of volume. Now, I know you say 35 million shares, Kenny, that's a lot of volume. Well, okay, I hear you. And it is a lot of volume when you're doing it manually on paper. But flash ahead to today, 35 million shares we trade in probably 3.5 minutes,
Right.
because of the technology.
And what percentage of that is people versus robots?
Well, well, we'll get into that
Whole other-
conversation. But
right.
what I mean is, and so when I came back in the summer of 1982, the gentleman who had actually offered me this job the prior summer was actually on the verge of almost going out of business because interest rates were really high. He wasn't doing any business. Customers were putting money in the bank. They weren't investing in the stock market, and so therefore he wasn't generating commissions. So he was hardly able to survive himself. Never mind, now listen, I was a kid. I was making $125 a week. It was 1982. And he couldn't even afford to pay me the $125 a week. And listen, he felt horrible about it.
Right.
But I understood. I was a kid going into my senior year of college. That was September, would have been my senior year of college. So I got it. But I had spent now 2 years down in New York. I knew a bunch of the people down there because I had spent. So before I just packed it in and decided to go back to Boston, I said, let me walk around a little bit and see what I can find out. And in fact, I went over to this other broker who I knew, and a gentleman who I ultimately went to work for. And then I went to work for him for 10 years because he offered me a job on graduation. But he had a fairly healthy business. He did a lot of that options expiration, a lot of options business, which was very, very busy. But there was always small orders, 500, 1,000 share lots all day long, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, maybe 2,500 shares, right? All day long, all day long, all day long. And
When we say options, this is equities around options
it was the equity side of what was the options transaction, right?
Okay.
So the option guys were out in Chicago.
It was underlying.
It was the underlying. So
Okay.
the options guys were out in Chicago, and they had to turn around and buy or sell the underlying equity, right? So it was options layoffs business is what it was called.
Okay.
And he had a fairly robust, healthy business because the options were actually very active, right? Options had become, kind of this new phenomenon. You could invest with little money and have lots of exposure versus having to invest in the actual stock and spend a lot of money, right? So that was kind of a part of the industry that was all of a sudden taking off in '82, even when the economy was having this struggling, right? So this guy he said to me, listen kid, can you answer the phone? Do you know a buy from a sell? Do you understand what the symbols are? Yes sir, yes sir, yes sir. Okay, great. Can you start tomorrow? I said, I'd love to start tomorrow. And he said to me, is $250 a week okay? $250 a week? I just got a 100% raise and I was thrilled, right?
Okay.
And so I did. And that was May, June, July of 1982. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. August 1982, August 11th, 1982. In my life, I will never forget it. Now, for a lot of the people that may be watching this, they're not going to remember what August 11th was, 1982. Okay, August 11th was a day that the Fed was coming out with their Fed statement. What were they going to do? Interest rates were 21%.
Unbelievable.
Interest rates were 21%, and so there was all this speculation. Paul Volcker was Fed chairman. Paul Volcker of today,
Volcker
where they talk about the Volcker rule.
Sure.
Okay, Paul Volcker was then Fed chairman. And there was all this speculation about what the Fed was going to do. And it was 8:30. The announcement comes out at 8:30.
Press release? Or?
It was the press release, the announcement, right? Yeah. Again, we were on the floor. I didn't see any of this, right? I was all dependent on the phone.
Right.
Well, at 8:30, the announcement comes out that the Fed was cutting interest rates by 2%. 2% was a big move.
At once, yeah.
Although rates were 21%, so 2% brought rates down to 19%, right? And it was like 8:30 and 15 seconds, and every phone lit up around the floor. You could hear the phones ringing, and it was like an explosion, right? And so you pick up the phone and you have these customers on the other end saying, they cut rates 2%. Well, honestly, I was a 21-year-old kid and I'm still trying to understand, well, okay, what does that really mean?
Right.
I'm not really sure.
Bye.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm still getting my feet wet, right?
Sure.
It was an explosive day. And that was the day that the market traded up 35 points, which represented 4.5%. Because the Dow was 800, right? We traded up 35 points on volume of 135 million shares. 4 times what had been the average daily volume.
Massive.
Still all on paper. And the market was up 35 points, which was a big move, right? I will never in my life forget it because I stood at that post from 8:30. I never left. I didn't go eat lunch. I didn't have a cup of coffee. I didn't go to the bedroom during the day at all.
All day. Yeah.
All day because you couldn't. You couldn't. And at the end of the day, when the bell rang at 4 o'clock, there was just paper everywhere because there was so many orders, right? And don't forget, if you see the old pictures of the exchange, paper used to get thrown on the floor, right? So by 10 o'clock, the wooden floor was covered with scrap paper and all that stuff. By the end of the day, on this day, the floor was so covered, it was the paper was up to your, past your ankles. There was that much paper on the floor. But the paper on the floor was just was the junk, right? All the receipts.
Orders, receipts, yeah.
Yeah, just junk. The receipts, you had in your pockets, right? You had them in the booth. And I'll never forget, we were there until 8 o'clock at night writing reports, right? I had to take all those receipts and I had to write reports. Write reports you had to write for every single price point, right? So I bought 5,000 shares at 20 and an eighth, and I'd have to write down.
Manually, right.
Manually, you have to write out a report, right? It was a buy. You went from the order, which is what I showed you before, to the actual report. And the report was, instead of a buy and sell pad, it was a bought and sold, right? Because now the action actually happened. It was completed. But you had to write down each individual transaction. So if I bought a total of 5,000 shares at $20, and I bought 500 shares from broker number 123, and I bought 1,000 shares from broker 875, and I bought 500 shares from broker 100, and I bought each individual transaction. You had to write it, right. We were there until 8 or 8:30 at night on that Thursday. It was truly amazing. It was. Look, I light up when I just think about it because I think about the energy in the room. I think about how unbelievable it was. And so that excitement, that was the beginning of the bull market in the 1980s, right? That day marked the beginning of the bull market.
So who do you think about personalities at that time?
The personalities were so colorful.
People you worked with, people you worked for.
The personalities were so colorful. Listen, in this business, don't forget, it was my generation that started to be the generation that came in that actually had a college education, right? Now, I'm not saying that, I'm not maligning anybody.
Sure.
Because what happened was, on the floor of the exchange, to be a broker on the floor of the exchange, you had to have street smarts. You had to have it in your gut. You had to be able to understand supply and demand. You had to be able to read people. You had to be able to understand what the customer wanted to. You had to synthesize all this information and understand how to play that game, hold your cards, but understand what the customer wanted to do, but understand what the crowd wanted to do, right? And all these different personalities is what made it so exciting. The personalities were colorful, you know, they were people from Brooklyn, people from Staten Island, people from Westchester, people from Long Island, people from Jersey, people from Connecticut, but they all had one thing in common. We were all type A personalities. We were all very, very, very excitable and energetic, and these were people that couldn't wait to walk through the door every single day. I used to jump out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning because I couldn't wait to get there.
Seems like you still do.
I do. It's different today, but I do.
Right.
But so that was the beginning of the bull market, right, 1982. And so that excitement, lasted for days and weeks afterwards. I mean, that excitement. Now, the volume subsided a little bit, and we didn't have, 4.5% moves every day, but it was truly the beginning of the bull market. So I left in September. I had to go back for my senior year in college. And in fact, this guy had offered me a job, said to me, listen, don't leave, stay here, transfer to NYU, go to school at night, blah, 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 blah. Here's
a compliment.
Okay, that's all well and good, except I knew that I knew my personality, and I knew I would never have done it. Now, think about this. I'd spent 3 years going to BU. I'd spent $30,000 because it used to cost $10,000 a year to go to Boston University. I'd spent $30,000. I had 1 year left. I knew my personality. I said, if I don't do it now, I know I'm never going to finish.
Right.
No problem. You go, and when you graduate in May, you come back. But see, now here's the point. That gentleman, you want to talk about the American story, the American dream? This guy at the time was 41 years old.
Do you want to say who the guy was? Or?
William Latham.
Okay.
I love this man. William Latham, and he's today he's 72 years old. He lives out in Long Island. But you want to talk about the American dream? This man lost his dad when he was a teenager. Lived out in Queens, and when he graduated high school, had no options. There was no going to college. It was go out and get a job. And so he came to the New York Stock Exchange and got a job in the janitorial department at the New York Stock Exchange.
You're kidding me.
He was sweeping the floors at night. That was the job he got. But he had the right personality.
Right.
And what happened was he's there, he's around at night, he'd be sweeping the floors, he'd be joking with the brokers that were there because he had the right personality. Like anything, one of the brokers took a liking to him, saw a spark in this kid's eye and the fire in his belly, and said to him, listen kid, you come work for me.
That's awesome.
And so he quit his job as a now, don't forget, you were working at the New York Stock Exchange. You had a union job, you had union benefits, you had union pay. He was a kid from Queens who didn't have, because his father died, didn't have a whole lot of guidance, and he just had a secure job. Now this guy offers him, you're going to quit that, you're going to come work for me. And so, he kind of stepped out of his comfort zone. Net, this was in the early 70s. And so he got trained. They trained him to be a clerk. He learned and he picked it up right away because, again, he had it in his belly, right? And so in 1974, the same gentleman forced him to go out and buy a seat at the New York Stock Exchange. Now, understand something. Seats then, I think he paid $55,000 for this seat. Not 1974, $55,000 is a lot of money.
A lot of money.
It's still a lot of money, but what I mean is, the guy said to him, you're going to buy this seat, and you're going to go out on your own, and you're going to create your own business. He forced him to buy the seat. He bought the seat. He worked that seat for 30 years of his career. He built a business, was extremely successful in the business. I worked for him for the last 10 years of his career. And then when he retired, he turned around and leased his seat out, which you could do. And at the time, leases went from, I think when he retired, leases were about $250,000 a year. You have to, if I leased a seat from you, I was paying you $250,000 a year.
Okay.
They went up to 300 and probably $340,000 at the height of the excitement in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the place went public in 2005, the seat represented the stock in the institution. He took that seat, he turned it in, because when the place went public, you turned your seat in and you got stock and cash.
Mm-hmm.
And so he walked away with $6.8 million, because that's what the seat then was worth in
From
that
55K.
transaction. He paid $55,000 for it. He worked it his whole career, so he built a career.
Sure.
And then he sold the seat for $6.8 million. At the end, he was, he might have been, 60 years old when that transaction happened. And so, he is the epitome of really that American dream.
Incredible story.
It's an incredible story. And I love to tell that story because this guy is the salt of the earth. He is just the salt of the earth. Anyway, so I went back to college in September of '82. I graduated. That was it.
What was your major?
Finance. I was a business major.
All right.
And then I graduated and I came to work in July of 1983.
Mm-hmm.
And listen, I'm a kid from Boston, right? I'm the middle of 5 in an Italian family. And my whole family lives in Boston. And so when I said to my mother, I'm moving to New York, she was clearly quite disappointed. I said, Mom, don't worry about it. I'll just go for a couple of years. I'll get some experience. I'll move back to Boston. Everything will be fine. 30 years later, I'm still here.
Right.
And 30 years later, she's still not talking to me because she's mad I never
She
came
sends
back.
you recipes at least?
Nah, she sends me recipes. Sure, she's the one who taught me how to cook. But anyway, so I came here in July 1983 and really started my career. Listen, 83, 84, all the way right up through the 90s, right up through the dot-com crash in 2000. It was just such an exciting place every single day. And the other thing is I met my wife on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah, that's another very interesting story. My wife is just a couple years older than I was, and so she's a kid who started right out of high school too, right? She didn't have the opportunity to go to college, and so she started as a runner on the floor in 1976. And 17 years old, and there she is now. Now understand this. My wife is Hispanic, right? She's Puerto Rican, so she was a woman, but she's now also a minority woman, right? And so she was down there as a runner, as a page squad, and then she got picked up by one of the small broker dealers that was going to train her to do what at the time was considered the women's job, and it was doing teletype, taking all those reports, the buy and sell reports that the male brokers executed, and then they would give them to all these women who sat around at these big teletype machines who would actually then enter these trades into the system.
What is teletype?
Teletype, it's like a data entry.
Okay.
Teletype is but that's
It's a
what they
regular
call,
keyboard.
That's
It's
what they
not like
that's so
shorthand, right?
funny. No, it's not. It's a regular keyboard.
Okay.
But that's what they call it, the
Okay,
teletype.
teletype.
And I don't even think they would use those words anymore, teletype, right? But it was like, it was a big keyboard. It wasn't a small little computer. It was a big, bulky keyboard. And it was connected to this big screen. And very funny. Now you're making me think about it. It was very funny. But it was a woman's job.
Right.
And so all these women used to sit around and teletype and enter these trades in. And so my wife said, okay, that's okay. I'll do this for a little bit, but I want his job. I want to be able to do his job. And it's very interesting. His job meant to be a clerk, to talk to the traders, to be in the thick of it, right? In 1977, that wasn't a woman's job.
Right.
And so she was told as much. No, that's not your job. Men do that job. You do this job.
Right.
You have to know my wife.
Different time.
She was not happy with that at all, and so she quit.
Wow.
And she got another job, and they said to her, "Yeah, we'll train you to do that, but you have to start on a teletype." Okay, she said, "I'll do that, but I want you to keep your promise." She went on the teletype. Then she said, "Okay." After a couple of months, okay, I'm ready now to. They wouldn't train her. She quit that job.
Wow.
And now she got another job.
It's resolve.
Very much. She got another job. Started as a teletype, but this was at Donaldson Lufkin, which no longer exists. Donaldson Lufkin. Red is now
DLJ,
First Boston.
right,
It's
okay.
now CS First Boston. And and there were a couple of guys over at Donaldson that really, really liked her, and they said to her, "You come over here. We're gonna train you and teach you." And in fact, they did. Dudley Apple, who ran.
Who was that?
Dudley Apple,
Okay.
who ran the equities department for Donaldson, was really not only a fan of hers, but she was such a fan of his. And he taught her. And he was, you talk to anyone who knows Dudley Apple, and Dudley Apple, you'd say his name and people would shake because he commanded that kind of respect around the street, right?
Wow.
But he was very good, and he taught her, and she worked very hard at Donaldson learning that business. And again, caught right on, because it's like a street thing, right? It's like you have to have street smarts. She didn't have a college education. She didn't, but you just get it, right? You understood supply and demand. You understood what it meant. You understood how to read a crowd. You understood what the customer wanted to do. You understood how aggressive and not aggressive you had to be.
I love that concept. I'm familiar with reading a person, but reading a crowd. is
Well, the
something
crowd, when I say reading the crowd, you would walk into a crowd. You'd walk
Right.
into Telephone, or you'd walk into Abbott Laboratories or Johnson & Johnson, and there would be a crowd of brokers
Right.
representing buyer to seller. So there could have been 3 buyers and 2 sellers. Well, there's a crowd. You had to be able to read what was going on here. How aggressive was this guy going to be? How much did he really have to buy? How much did this guy have for sale? Now, if there's 3 buyers and 1 seller, you really know who's controlling this crowd. The
Right.
seller's controlling the crowd because there's 3 buyers.
Right.
The seller now has to represent, or the seller has to understand, for him, knowing that he's the only seller and there's 3 buyers, how aggressive is this guy going to be? How aggressive is he going to be? And how aggressive is he going to be?
And these guys probably know each other?
Of course they know each other.
Of course,
You and
yeah.
I could have been best friends.
Right.
But during the day, you and I could have been, public enemy number 1.
Right.
Because I had a job to do, you had a job to do. But at 4 o'clock, the greatest thing about that, at 4 o'clock when the bell rang, you put your gloves down, and you and I are going out to dinner, we're going out for a drink, whatever it was. But it was a camaraderie.
Sure.
It was a sense of such camaraderie down there that it was truly amazing. It's fraternal, right? It's collegiate. It's I can't even describe to you how wonderful it was. You ask anybody, and they'll stutter. They're trying to think of the word to describe how special it was, right? And if people were in trouble, or if there was a problem, or somebody's kid got sick, or somebody's wife got sick, the place just came together and supported you. And if you were out, they were supporting you by helping you run your business and helping you, still be able to create an income so you could take care of what you had to take care of. Charity, we were charitable. We had this Members Handicapped Children's Fund, which was started by members years ago that had a sick child. Kids had illness. And it still exists today, that fund. But it was truly, on that level, it was truly amazing. But anyway, so she.
I just want to say that it sounds like I've heard so much of this mythology of what the market was like at that time.
I can't even.
And I didn't know if it really was.
It was that and more.
Yeah.
I'm not even doing justice to really tell you. But you ask anybody that was down there, and they will have the same kind of reaction trying to describe it the way I am, right? The way they'll use the same words. They'll get emotional. Honestly, you get emotional about it.
I think everybody kind of
The bond
wants that, and so to hear these stories is great.
You
right? People-
want it, but because when you think about 5,500 people in a space, you think all day long we would be this close to each other, right? And the tension. Sometimes on the stocks, depending on the news out or whatever, how active or busy the stocks were, create a lot of tension. But type A personalities you just did it, right? People would say to me, "How do you do it? How do you do it? How do you do it?" I don't know. You just do it.
Right.
And it was like second nature. And don't forget, I wasn't just in Johnson & Johnson. I could have been in Johnson, General Electric, Telephone, Abbott Laboratories, and Coke all at the same time.
Right.
So I'm processing, as is everybody. You're processing all these different conversations because they don't trade at the same prices, right? Telephone traded at $19. Coke was trading at $50. Telephone's more liquid, so it trades more. Coke was less liquid, it traded less, right? And so therefore, the market in each individual stock would trade differently because of the market capitalization. Stock outstanding. Buyers and sellers in the crowd. People always thought the specialist dictated where the stock went. That is so not true. The buyers and sellers in the crowd is the ones who dictated. If I was a really aggressive buyer and I kept wanting to buy stock, I'd take it. The specialist couldn't control
Right.
me. I want to buy it. Where's it offered? It's offered at half, I take it. Where's it offered at 3/4, I take it. Where's it offered at 51? I take them. He couldn't control that. That was me as a customer, right? I was representing an institution that wanted to buy this stock as aggressively or not as they wanted to.
Right.
Conversely, the seller could do the same thing. He might have had a customer that had 1 million shares of something that he was trying to sell, and the customer said, listen, I want out. Sell the stock. Okay, where's the bid? 50.5 bid? Sold. Where's the next bid? 50.25? Sold. Where's the next bid? 50.8? Sold. And so that's what would happen. So the notion that a specialist controlled the stock is completely unfounded.
How many
Completely
specialists
unfounded.
per stock? 1 or 2? I mean,
Well, there was one specialist assigned per stock, but don't forget there were there were companies down there, specialist companies that made markets. So
Right.
if you and I worked at the same specialist company, you had your panel of stocks, I had my panel of stocks, but we worked at the same company. If I needed help, you could jump in and help.
Sure.
But the guy across in the post next door who worked for a different company, you couldn't go over there and help him because that was a different company, right?
I'm sorry I took you away, but your wife,
No, no.
how did you guys?
So Evelyn then was at Donaldson, and they taught her very well, and she really loved it there. But then she had an opportunity, 1982, I believe, to go work at Goldman Sachs. Now you have to understand something. Now Goldman's a great firm. Today it is still a great firm. There's no one's questioning. But Goldman Sachs didn't have women on the floor that were clerks. They had women that were the teletype girls, but they didn't have women that were clerks. And
She
so
was the first?
she was the first at Goldman.
Wow.
And she was not only a woman, but now she's a Puerto Rican woman. So now she's a minority on top of it, right? She's a minority as a woman, but now she's a minority because of her ethnicity.
Right.
And they offered her a job at Goldman Sachs, and they gave her a zone. A zone meant a whole area she was responsible for. And so she had, guys that worked for her, right? She ran the zone, but she was on the phone doing the business, but she also had guys that worked for her. And she was as good as anybody. And she could do it with her eyes shut. She could, and she put up with listen,